As we have been seeing, rhyme can contribute in a wide variety of ways to what an individual poem is saying or doing. It is important we recognise this variety, because whereas it is true that there may well be some general correspondences between the way in which rhyme operates in one poem and the way it operates in another poem, we should never assume rhyme is doing exactly the same things for exactly the same reasons or with exactly the same effects in different poems. Instead, we should remember that rhyme is always a part of a greater whole. It interacts with, shapes, and is in turn shaped by the other elements of the poem, such as metre, genre, but also the poem's themes. Now, because this mixture of things that makes up each and every individual poem will always be to some degree unique, the contribution rhyme makes to that poem, the way it interacts with the other elements of the poem, will always be unique as well. Now, to illustrate this, I'm going to comment briefly on the contribution rhyme makes to the poems we've been discussing earlier in this module. Emily Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility and R.S. Thomas's Comparisons. Moving on to Emily Dickinson's poem I Dwell in Possibility, this gestures towards a fairly set poetic genre, a ballad. Although, as we saw elsewhere, Dickinson does not adhere as closely to the ballad form, and we'll build this recognition into our interpretation of the role that rhyme plays in this poem. So just to review very quickly some of the formal features of this poem, the ballad form traditionally has a line of 4 beats followed by a line of 3 beats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. This flows quite naturally. It conveys a sense of happiness and joy often, and it's associated not just with ballads but with hymns and nursery rhymes. And we saw elsewhere that Dickinson keeps this structure present in the background, as it were, but constantly plays around with it, constantly disrupts it. If you recite this poem to yourself, you'll notice it doesn't quite, or at least always, adhere to this very clear rhythm. Sometimes it has too many syllables, sometimes too few. And at the same time, she uses these dashes at the end of almost every line as a way of, if not necessarily breaking the all too easy flow of the da-dum, 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 at least bringing its transitions into question. Rather than using this form to meld things readily together, she disrupts the form to question the solidity, if you like, of some of the equations that she appears to draw. And I would say this is a replication of what she's saying about the House of Poetry in this poem, that it's a house of possibility. And this means really 2 things. It means, in a sense, anything is possible. All kinds of things can be put together in all kinds of different ways. That's partly why she puts together this and other of her poems in a variety of different ways. But perhaps it's also a possibility in the sense that it's not always necessarily a reality. It's something to be striven towards, but not always achieved. Anyhow, after that brief survey or review then, how does rhyme, what kind of part does rhyme play in all of this? Well, I've marked in red here the clearest rhymes in the poem, and you can see that there's one set of rhymes per stanza: prose, windows, I, sky, this, paradise. But we get quite a bit of variety here. The first stanza, the rhyme words are next to one another in the middle. in the next two stanzas, they appear in the second and the fourth lines. And I think, again, this illustrates this notion that poetry can be put together in different ways to different effects. But there are also quite different kinds of rhymes. In the second stanza, I and sky are full rhymes. They're strong lines, they're clear, and I think it reflects a certain certainty about what is being said in that stanza. The rhymes of the first and third stanza, meanwhile, are much more provisional, much less solid. Think about prose and windows. It rhymes, but whereas the emphasis is on the monosyllabic prose in the first word, the stress in the rhyming word is actually on win. Prose, windows. There's a certain fading. And I think, again, this is rather like the dashes that come after them. There's a sense of provisionality here, of tentativeness. Again, exemplifying this notion that poetry is possible, it's full of possibility in the sense that almost everything can be put together in interesting ways. Prose, windows, who would have thought, what's the relation between them? But also possible in the sense of not necessarily or always fully realised. Do prose and windows really fit together, or is this a kind of aspiration, a desire, something that we try out temporarily and then move on to something else? And I think something similar can then be said about the rhyme in the final stanza. This paradise. It's not really a full rhyme, is it? It's close, but it's not exact. And what is the poem saying at this point? It's saying this activity of poetry can lead you to paradise. But I think, again, the emphasis is on can in what I've just said. It may do, but it may also not do. For some people it will, some of the time. For others it won't, any of the time. So this association of poetry and paradise is a powerful one. It's one the poem wishes to present us with, to get us to think about. But there's also a certain uncertainty or ambiguity about it, emphasised by the dashes. The poem ends not with a full stop but with a dash, but also by this rhyme that isn't quite a rhyme. Does poetry really chime with, does it really fit with the idea of paradise? So here's another example in how a poem's use of rhyme can be interlocking, commenting upon some of the statements it makes as well. So finally we come to R.S. Thomas's poem Comparisons. And in my discussion of the poem elsewhere, I've actually already said pretty much everything that I wish to say about rhyme in this poem, but I'm just going to reiterate some of the key points I would wish to make. Now, the first of these is that this is not a poem like Dickinson's. It does not belong to a preset genre which has a preset way of organising its lines. It's R.S. Thomas's own construction, as it were. On top of that, it makes only very spare use of rhyme. I've marked on the screen two sets of rhymes that I think are important to the poem. The one in red, her, feather, anchor, and the one in green, rested, nest, lest, lest. So rhyme has a different profile in this poem, and as a consequence I think it plays a rather different role. Its primary purpose, I feel, is to add a degree of drama, to control the pace at which the poem proceeds, the pace and the ambience within which we experience it. Let's then take the rhymes in red to see how it does this. The poem begins, "To all light things I compared her." Now this sets up the project of the poem. He's trying to find something that describes her, or to put it another way, he's trying to find an image that rhymes with her. And as we've seen before, if you read out the whole stanza, it sounds like there's a very clear rhyme here. To all light things I compared her, pause, to a snowflake, a feather. This, though, is not quite what Thomas writes. That would only work if the second line ended with her and the third one began with to, because then it would be as if everything has been resolved. He's trying to find something that chimes with her. Well, feather chimes with her. But by placing this to in the middle, it creates a pause. It keeps those two things apart and shows that the comparison is one that's being tried out tentatively rather than one that is already achieved. And then in the rest of the poem, we see him experience the inadequacy of these kinds of comparisons. The lightness of them doesn't really work. As he says in the penultimate stanza, feathers are blown away. And then at the end he comes in with a more surprising image. I have let her ashes down in me like an anchor. And we can distantly still hear her and feather before. He's found something that works. It's something surprising, but also by ending on this rhyme word, we get a sense of something being anchored as well. So this is one more example of how rhyme can enable a poem to enact what it also says. So what about the rhymes in green? Well, as you will remember, this is a moment the speaker's recalling at which the woman he's trying to describe or encapsulate is resting on his arm at a dance. It's a moment of poise, and she wishes to hold that moment. She wants to keep it light because otherwise things might fall apart. And part of the power of the poem is that it enacts out, it plays out how words keep moving on. You cannot really hold them back. A sentence has a certain logic that has to be fulfilled, just as life does. And this moment of poise will collapse. In a sense, the eggs will break, she will die, the snow will be inadequate, the feathers will be inadequate as images. But in using these lines, these rhymes highlighted in green, it's as if the poem is trying to stop this movement, to hold it up. She rested. So this rhyme places emphasis on the important word rest, though we don't know it's a rhyme yet, but it will be made so retrospectively. As a bird on its nest lest, that makes us take our time, it holds us up. The eggs break lest. Again, by recording lest, nest and rest, it holds us back, and it also comes at the end of the line. So in a way it's moderating, it's modulating and regulating our movement through the poem in a way that replicates the poem's attempt, at this point at least, to hold things back, to stop them going into flux and then melting and blowing away. That's all then I would say about rhyme in this poem, but I hope what you've seen in this video is that there are some correspondences between the ways in which these two poems employ rhymes, but that each of them deployed in ways that are individual to and specific to the poems to which they belong. And this is something we really need to attend to when we try to interpret the role or the contribution that rhyme is making